Hello, good evening. I'm Brooke Kroger. I'm a professor here at New York University in the NYU Arthur L. Carter Journalism Institute. This is a production of the Local East Village, which is our project, community outreach project with the New York Times. We are joined in sponsorship for this event with Museum Studies. Bruce, would you stand up? Bruce Altschuler. And I don't know if Marvin Taylor is here from Fales Library, but those are our partners. We have sponsorship from the Knight Foundation, from the New York Council for the Humanities, and from the NYU Humanities Initiative, and from a great Evo fan, Alan Abramson, who inspired this entire production. Alan, where are you? I have to go through a few more thank yous so we can get started. This is our feeble attempt at a cultural rescue. It's been about a 9-month adventure, and we're very, very excited to have all of you here with us tonight and our distinguished panel. I need to say a few thank yous to a few other important people, including Perry Klass, the director of the Institute currently, Kate Panuska and Andrea Rosenberg, who many of you have been in touch with in getting to be here tonight, and young Nikki Birch, who is an MA candidate in Museum Studies, who has really almost single-handedly put together the exhibition downstairs. She's curated it, she's organized, she's collected, she's been in Charlie Frick's garage. She has really done all of this, and we want to say a special thank you to her. Nikki, are you here somewhere? She isn't here for her thank you? Anyway, you should hire her. She's fabulous. We also have some seats up here in the front row that people can come take if they'd like to, so you want to do that really quickly, that would be great. Feel free. And I want to run through the names of the Evo alumni, every single one of whom has provided material, photographs, ideas, goodwill, good cheer, love, all the kinds of things that have made this event so warm. A.J. Weberman, Alan Abramson, Alan Schenker, who's Yossarian. I hope he's here. Are you here? Are you here? Is he here? Not yet. Charlie Frick, Alex Gross, Claudia Dreyfus, Coca Crystal, Dan Ratiner, Deanne Stillman, Ed Sanders, Gil Weingort, Ishmael Reed, J.C. Morrison, Jason Katzman, Joe Kane, John Wilcock, who also spent special greetings and I think is watching us from California. Hello, John. Catherine Stream, Kim Deitch. Kim, are you here? We're waiting for Kim. Larry Sloman, Larry Ratzo Sloman, Linda Crawford, Michael Simmons, Bob Simmons, Patricia Morris, Peter Legere, Rayanne Rubenstein. Is Rayanne here? You're expecting her too. Ray Schultz, Rex Weiner. Rex is here.
Who's Rex?
Spain Rodriguez, Steve Krause. Steve is here. Hi, Steve. Stephen Ellman from Florida. Stephen Heller on the stage. Trina Robbins, who's in California. And that's our group. And now I'd like to introduce the editor of the Local East Village, Daniel Maurer. Thank you.
And thank you all for being here today. I, in turn, would like to introduce our moderator, John McMillan. He's a professor of history at Georgia State University, specializing in the 20th century social movements and the Vietnam era. He is the author of he's the founding editor of The 60s, a journal of history, politics, and culture, and the co-editor of a couple of books, Protest Nation and The Radical Reader, and the co-author of The New Left Revisited. And most importantly for our purposes tonight, he is the author of Smoking Typewriters, the 60s Underground Press and the Rise of Alternative Media in America, which was succinctly called by Kirkus, a readable, richly detailed study of the hundreds of anti-establishment 1960s newspapers, a welcome book of the 1960s, a nostalgia trip for those who were there, and a vivid work of history for anyone curious about the journalism that jolted a decade, which of course is what we'll be talking about tonight. He's also at work on a book The Beatles versus the Stones, the history of a legendary rivalry. So maybe you can start off by telling us which one you like.
I don't take a position in the book. Are we going? Thank you
Without
so
further
much. Thank you so much for coming out. It's really wonderful to see so many people. I expected there to be a large turnout, but I'm glad to see it. We have a really wonderful group of panelists, a very eclectic and accomplished and interesting bunch of people. You know, I wrote this book, Smoking Typewriters. It's an academic study of the underground press. And I didn't go into, you know, too much detail about the East Village Other, but I really could have, and maybe I should have. It was one of the pioneering papers of the era. It was one of the first underground papers, founded in 1965. And it mattered a great deal to the people who read it. It's the type of paper that people would, you know, rush to pick up as soon as it came out. It was read and appreciated with an unusual amount of intensity, and it attracted a tremendous amount of talent and creativity. And so I'm excited to help do what I can to chair this panel tonight. I was born in 1970, and so obviously, why is that funny? Obviously, I missed out on the 60s, and then I don't think there's a word in the English language for having nostalgia for something that you didn't really experience. But sometimes I do have that feeling like I missed out on something. I lived in New York for a while in the sort of mid and late 1990s, and I never lived in the East Village, but it was always the neighborhood I liked the most, and I have a lot of appreciation for the era. The one thing that I think I would not have liked about this social movement protest activity is the endless, long, never-ending meetings that used to go on and on. And so I've been empowered tonight to summon this doesn't come easily to me, but to summon my inner dictator, if necessary, to sort of keep the panel moving on time. And I'm hopeful. Hopefully,
time? What's that?
Well, you see, so hopefully we can have a very fruitful conversation. We have a lot of material to cover in just a short amount of time. I'll try to keep a conversation going for about 60 or so minutes, and then we'll allow time for the audience to raise questions and stimulate some discussion. And I'm hoping that we can do this in a fruitful way with just a minimal amount of chaos. So let me just start. Can I introduce the panelists real quickly and then get going? From on my right, I guess your left, this is Ed Sanders. A lot of you people know Ed. He's a poet, a singer, an author, an artist, a publisher. He came to New York City from Missouri in 1958 and settled in Greenwich Village. And he got his degree from NYU, where he studied Greek. And he was the proprietor of the Peace-Eye bookstore over on 10th Street. And he was the founder of a very interesting and satirical and clever rock band that you all know called the Fugs. Woo! And he's won numerous awards and fellowships for his prose. And his most recent book, if everyone could shut off their cell phones, that would be ideal.
You see, you got your inner dictator.
Already. It's surprising how quickly it comes out. His most recent book is called Fug You, and it's an informal history of the counterculture and the Peace-Eye bookstore and the Fugs and everything else. It got a neat review in the Times not too long ago, and I'm really excited to get that book. So Ed Sanders. Dan Ratiner is right here. He was one of three partners who founded the East Village Other in 1965. He was born and raised in New Jersey. He graduated from the University of Rochester in 1961. He did some graduate work at Harvard, and today he runs Dan's Papers, which is a free weekly newspaper that keeps track of some of the goings-ons and happenings in the Hamptons. He writes, this is very impressive, approximately 300 articles every year on topics ranging from science to humor to sports to world affairs to architecture and history and scandals. It's a lot of stuff. He's written 12 books, including a 2008 memoir, In the Hamptons, My 50 Years with Farmers, Fishermen, Writers, Artists, Billionaires, and Celebrities, which was published by Random House. This is Claudia Dreyfus to my right. She started her career writing for the East Village Other in the mid-'60s, and since then she's continued writing as a journalist, and she's also been a professor. She currently teaches at the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University, and she writes for the Thursday Science section of Tuesday section of the New York Times. Thanks. Her most recent book, which got a tremendous amount of attention and acclaim, is called Higher Education, with a question mark. She co-wrote it with Andrew Hacker. The subtitle is How Colleges Are Wasting Our Money and Failing Our Kids and What We Can Do About It. So Claudia Dreyfus. Alex Gross, to my left, is the author of a book called The Untold 60s, When Hope Was Born, which is a very richly detailed and personally informed account of the underground press in the 60s as it unfolded in London and Berlin and Amsterdam, as well as New York City. And he has a wonderfully eclectic personality. He speaks 5 languages. He has designed light boxes and light art. He is a serious scholar of Chinese medicine. He's taught sex education classes with his wife, and he is trained in the family profession of cartography. Alex. Steve Heller, left of Alex, has been publishing, he started publishing cartoons and drawings in underground newspapers at the age of just 16, and then later on he became the art director of several underground publications, and then he became the art director for the New York Times for its op-ed page at first, and then also the New York Times book review. He is the co-founder and co-chair of the MFA Designer as Author program at the School of Visual Arts, where he lectures on the history of graphic design. And this is astonishing, he is the author or co-author or editor of over 140 books on design and popular culture. And then to my far left is Peter Legere. He was a publisher and a shareholder and an editor of the East Village Other at various times between about 1966 and 1970. He's been something of a fixture on the Lower East Side for a very long time. He went to Siena College and then New York University's law school. He was the publisher of Gothic Blimp Works comics. He's a sculptor. He's owned and operated a sculpture supply store for about 25 years. It used to be located on East 12th Street. And he's also a community activist. He became involved in the artist rights movement. He was the president of the Foundation for the Community of Artists. He founded the 12th Street Block Association, where citizens would gather for meetings about social issues of local concern. And nowadays he divides his time between Pennsylvania and the Lower East Side. So I'm going to shoot out some questions. I thought I would start with Dan, just because he was, he was with the East Village Other from the very beginning, at its inception. And I wonder if you could just tell us, for people who aren't familiar, I know most people here are familiar, but how would you describe the East Village Other to, let's say, a college student or a younger person today who wasn't familiar with the paper? What was its mission, its aesthetics, and how did it get going originally?
It was a completely unique thing. I first actually saw an issue of it, if you want to call it that. It wasn't a newspaper. It was a monthly. A little louder. It was it had come out in October of '65, and the publisher and writer of most of it was Walter Boart, who I had never heard of. I still remember picking up a copy of it at a newsstand on the corner of 6th Avenue and 8th Street, and I immediately called him. And the reason I did was several-fold. One is that I'd already, by that time, I was 25, 26 years old, and I had founded and was already publishing 3 or 4 summer newspapers that were only out in that period of time. I was in the city. I didn't have a whole lot to do with myself. I had enough money to get through the winter. I was living on the west side, not on the east side. And I'd read the Village Voice, and I didn't like it. And here was this thing, and you'll see it out in the thing. It doesn't do it justice. It unfolded into a giant piece of paper about 3 by 4 feet. That was all it was. All the articles and headlines were all in different directions. You had to turn it to read it in different ways. And I remember standing on the corner and thinking, this guy, whoever he is, has seized upon the new way of printing, which had happened only about a year earlier. And I knew about that because of I had changed over from my other publications out on Eastern Long Island. And what that was the leaving off, sadly, of hot lead journalism, where things were done the old-fashioned way since the beginning, Gutenberg, really. And at that point, it was all cut and paste. You'd use, and you could create a page however you wanted. Well, most newspapers in making the transition, in fact, all newspapers, simply tried to mimic what they had been doing before. They didn't want people to think it was anything new, except that it was sharper and clearer. Here was a guy who turned the whole thing upside down graphically and had these fiery diatribes about legalizing marijuana, ending the war in Vietnam. And I said, I got to call this guy, because there were other thoughts in my mind. Even at that point, wherever I would go, if I felt I was in a neighborhood where there could be a newspaper and there wasn't one, I would think I could do a newspaper. I knew how to do it, and I did a number of times in my lifetime. But this one, I thought, there is no East. The East Village is being born. At this point, I considered myself kind of an old beatnik or a young beatnik. We didn't do anything. Beatniks just complained. We sat around drinking coffee in coffee houses with black T-shirts and talked philosophy and thought we were really very wise. But as far as the big issues of the day were concerned, because up through the 50s, it was all about doing everything the way the government wanted you to do it. Everything was a little ticky-tacky, as in that song. And all of a sudden, things had kind of exploded, literally. Jack Kennedy was killed. There was other people killed. And suddenly, there was this new a slightly younger generation than me that was growing up wild. And they were willing to do lots of things some of which I was like terrified of doing myself.
May I pick up on that for a second,
Yeah, sure.
Dan? Often my students ask me what the 60s were like. And what I say to them was that it's a time when it was important to be young, when young people had a voice, and if they didn't have a voice, they grabbed the voice and they made it theirs. And that is what Evo was. It was the voice of the generation. It was wildly chaotic. It was people saying the first thing that was on their mind, for better or for worse, but it was about freedom. And then I say to my students, I wish you have that same experience. One of the glorious things about being here tonight is to relive it and to see old friends and to really feel proud about the wonderful thing that we did in that time and place. Thank you for coming tonight.
Yes. I'll try and wrap this up quickly. The East Village at that time was very dirty, very dangerous, very drug-ridden. And here I was, a guy from Eastern Long Island, and a little bit intimidated by it. But I called Walter up, I went to see him, and I said, this could be a weekly newspaper. And my idea of it was that it would be a very edgy Village Voice, that it would be something that would compete with the Village Voice. And he sort of bought that, but he wanted to do this whole other thing. And I said, that's great. You do it your way, I'll do it this way. It'll be great. And so I brought my knowledge to bear for the second issue, which I brought my Jeep into town, and we were distributing it to Gem Spa and some other places. And it was so wild and amazing to me. And I hired people to sell advertising for it. I went out myself on St. Mark's Place, and so we had set up an office on Avenue A. I think it was Avenue A, might have been. 47
It was Avenue A
Avenue
in Tompkins Square.
Right.
I went to that office when I was 15 years old. They threw me out, by the way. And that destroyed my self-esteem for the next year.
Well, I'm going to turn this over to someone else, because what happened is in April, the violins of the beach got to me, and I had my job to do. And so I picked up and left. It was pretty amicable. I said, I'll come back in the fall if you need me. But by that time, Walter and myself and Alan Katzman, and this is the amazing part, it really is, had formed a corporation. Alan's brother was an accountant at a shoe factory. And he was very straight, and he set up a stock company with 9 shares. We each got 3 shares. And it always amazed me that something as totally anti-establishment as this was would actually have been founded in the same way that Alan's brother was doing work at the shoe store.
The only
And that's what
correction
happened.
I would make to that is I've lived in this neighborhood and still live in this neighborhood. I've lived down here for over 50 years. It wasn't that dangerous particularly. I mean, if you were hanging, we had lots of Poles and lots of Ukrainians and still a fair number of Jews. It's a wonderful neighborhood. And it might have seemed dangerous to someone from Long Island.
Well, it did, or from the West Village, which is where I was spending the winter.
I wanted to put a question to Ed Sanders, a similar question. You must come in contact with college students when you're doing your poetry readings and whatnot, and you played such a pivotal role in the East Village countercultural scene. But how do you describe it to someone who's not familiar? What was sort of the essence of the East Village Other? What was the paper about to an uninformed, younger person?
Well, it was the second underground press. The first one was the Los Angeles Free Press, and I remember Walt Bohr was a bartender at Stanley's Bar where we all drank on Avenue B, and he asked me to get involved, and I was busy with the Fugs, and I had the Peace-Eye bookstore. So they opened up at 147 Avenue A, which is now a Mexican food store. I just went there the other day. My own bookstore, Peace-Eye, moved there after Evo moved over to 2nd Avenue in late '67. But what inspired me about Evo was that it was a neighborhood paper at the beginning. They covered the street. They covered what was going on, arrests, when the cops raided the hippie communes during the Summer of Love. They covered it. Walt Bohr was out there writing articles, and yet at the same time, they were strongly against the war. They were pro-pot, and unlike any other publication in the East, they were pro-LSD. They gave Timothy Leary a big opportunity to publish whatever he wanted. And then they were helpful to the rise of the underground comic movement. They had a design that he brought up that was non-linear. It escaped the Gutenberg Bible double column and spread all out, like the visions people were having on mescaline and LSD and pot. The blobby universe with all its commixture, anti-war, pro-peace, and they began to get ads from record companies, which were very important in the overall mix. And then up came hippie boutiques. So they had an ad base. My wife and I ran a newspaper for 8 years in Woodstock, and it's difficult to keep it going. And Evo managed to do it for 7 years. So anyway, I think it was marvelous. They had Spain Rodriguez for cartoons. They had Captain High with Bill Beckman. They had Gilbert Shelton. The same issue that had the article about the Sharon Tate murders, they had a big spread by Gilbert Shelton, the great cartoonist. So they encouraged Trina Robbins, Art Spiegelman. R. Crumb lived in the Lower East Side for a while, and they encouraged that art form. So they encouraged art, they encouraged music, they encouraged this new vision, I call it, new vision for America, for a better world. And the staff, I used to, hanging out during Paste Up was a kind of thing to do. I didn't do it when they went over to 2nd Avenue, but the early issues, it was quite a group effort. That's what I mean. It was had a communal spirit. And I know from running a newspaper for 8 years that there's always hassles and fighting and bickering and bitching and complaining and cabals and cliques against cliques and worry about money. And then February comes and there's no ads. March comes, a little more ads. Then ads return in April and May and June. And then February, no more ads again. So I don't know.
I just want
Peter.
to say, I think that the paper had an enormous impact on, I think the paper had an enormous impact on the changes that took place in society during that whole era, in terms of drugs, war, censorship, just fun, play and fun. I think that it wasn't until this kind of thing appeared that you could conceivably have outdoor cafes in Manhattan. We didn't have them. They were against the law. Or banners on buildings. I mean, it just, the whole thing, I always wondered why this wasn't celebrated much more than it was. It just seemed to, vanish. And I thought it was very seminal, and I thought that was Walter's vision.
It didn't vanish, I think, exactly by accident. The very same things that gave it strength made it sort of what the Marxists would call, it had its internal contradictions. Like nobody was good at business, and the business part was left to people who weren't so great at it, and with the exception of Peter Legere, who's here, who was maybe the one sane person on the business side, and who,
Village Other?
yeah, and who, while there, I mean, I always mark the beginning of the end of your leaving, because you were the stable, sane kind of presence that you could go to and something rational would happen. You were the only person who wasn't on acid, and me, because I was the square at the party.
Vaughn Bodie, when he drew me, he always portrayed me as a cross between Captain Hook, Captain Bligh, and Napoleon. So I don't know about, calm. It was a collaboration.
Yeah.
One of the things about the East Village Other is that it did not have any rules of censorship. That's number one. If you trust your artists, and that is a very difficult thing to do, but we did that. We said, if this person is good enough to throw something up on a page, you have to be able to have confidence in their ability to make it work. Not only that, I always believe that more than one person should be involved in making art. So we had a lot of collaboration. And if I used to yell and scream about anything, it's got to be better. And everyone could pitch in. There was work that started by someone, and then someone else looked at it, made a snotty comment, and then said, okay, here you go, you do it better. And they would throw their stuff on top of it. It wasn't always the greatest thing in the world, but it was different, it was experimental, and as I say, if you have to do something, you have to trust your artist. That's one thing that all editors are afraid of. And I was afraid of it too. But I said, okay, it's the rule, let's stick by it. And something nice happened. The East Village Other actually blew everyone's mind. That's its legacy, that's its record. There is before Evo, and then there's after Evo. And all of the creativity that we see is sort of like working off of what Evo started. And today, my only lament is that we cannot have in the East Village the artist colony that used to be.
Right.
There was a time when all of the storefronts here had artists in them because businesses couldn't be in the East Village. And all those artists are gone, and the reason why they're gone is because there was a cultural policy instituted toward the end of the East Village Other. And the East Village Other may have been responsible for part of that cultural policy. And that cultural policy was invented here in New York City, and it was instituted by my favorite president, Richard Milhouse Nixon. And what it did was to segregate artists from the arts. And it did that by creating a new world called the arts. And that's a world that's inhabited solely by corporations. So you will never again be able to see, I think, that kind of collaboration, which was not corporate, but it was people to people to people. It was artist to artist to artist. Free. And Evo, if it's anything, was the last expression of the Bohemian artist colony.
In a single sentence, Evo was the flagship of the entire 60s movement and had an influence beyond these shores. I first saw my copy in London. I took copies of Evo and of London papers to Berlin. We started something in Berlin. Evo came first.
I want to pose a couple questions to Stephen and Claudia, and then next to Alex. But both of you have, started out working in, in the underground realm, and you've had considerable mainstream success. And I wondered if you can talk about the crossover experience. How did your time working for the underground press shape your experience subsequently?
Well, first of all, I'm glad to be the youngest person on the panel, except for you. That's what I always liked about being in the underground. Everybody was 2 years older. Charlie Frick and I were always the youngsters. And it felt good because people just thought, we're the kids, and we could get away with murder. And that was a wonderful thing about being in the underground press. You could get away with more than murder. You could get away with a lot of anti-establishment rhetoric and art and life. And for me, Evo was one of the two goals that I had in my life. One goal was to work on covers for Evo, because I remember the first cover I saw was after Cardinal Spellman. He was that awful cardinal in New York who was the vicar of the U.S. Army, and he died, as many people do. And the cover was a photograph of him with the headline, "Congratulations on your promotion," which to me is still the best headline. And Peter wrote that. To my dying day, when I have aphasia, I will remember that headline. The other was of William Westmoreland, the general of the Army, and it was a collage in the manner of John Hartfield, who I didn't know of then, and it was a snake coming out of his uniform. And it was just so amazing that a publication, and at this point they must have drifted into mainstream newsstands, because I didn't see it down in the Village. I saw it on 23rd Street, uptown. But in answer to your question, I wanted to work for Evo and I wanted to work for the New York Times. I couldn't get a job at Evo, so I ended up at the Times. When I went to the New York Times, actually I ended up at Evo thanks to Ray Schultz, because he needed somebody to lay out his pages, and he was having a feud or something with Charlie maybe. And I came in and I just did his pages. I wouldn't touch anybody else, and I used ruling tape, and I used a ruler, and I used a blue pencil to make sure everything was straight. And then when it went to the printer, somehow everything was askew. We used wax in those days, and it kind of dried on the way to the printer on the subway. But it informed Evo, and I worked for the New York Free Press, the New York Rat, Avatar, Screw. I was the first art director of Screw. And I started a paper called the New York Review of Sex, which I was busted for a couple of times, and it always influenced my life. And when I got to the New York Times, I became a great oddity because I came out of this environment. And they hired me because I came out of this environment, the oddest thing, because I was one of the few people who was an art director in those days who actually worked on a newspaper. And so I knew what newspapers were, and I knew how to work with headlines. I knew how to work with art. I knew how to work with illustrators. So many of the illustrators I worked with in the underground papers ended up going to the Times. So there was quite a lineage, and it was a wonderful bit of fun. And when I left the Times, about 4 years ago. I'm still there on contract as a writer, but when I left as art director, the book review editor assigned me a piece to write a book review about Al Goldstein from Screw. And so I could just tell my entire story for the entire world to hear. And finally, my parents figured out what I did.
Claudia, how about the same question for you?
Well, I don't know, because my own personal history and my career is so idiosyncratic. And I don't feel like I'm that different a person now than I was then. I wouldn't say I was like the typical Evo reporter in many ways. I was sort of like, I always felt like Margaret Dumont among the Marx Brothers. I was the square, but I was having a good time as the square. I mean, I was a happy square. I wasn't a grumpy square. And
you were also very, very, very attractive, and
Everyone was in love
with you. Yeah, including me. If you
I didn't know
notice
this.
that I
Why
used to
didn't
hang out in
anyone
front
say
of
that?
your apartment.
I was so unhappily married at the time. but this is well known. But at any rate, you know, I enjoyed the freedom to express myself in a way that I didn't have in my previous job, where I had been a trade union organizer and had to get up at 5 in the morning and leaflet workers. And I actually see a worker I organized here, Peter Mitchell. It's true. I was a terrible union organizer, and I didn't have any discipline. And going back to Evo gave me personally a chance to be young, and I had been too old in the other job. And I guess it just gave me courage to be myself more, and that's something I take with me now. Let me also say, I mean, I think one of the reasons why I'm a good interviewer is that I bring myself into the interviews, and I'm not afraid to do that. A lot of other interviewers are. That's something I learned at Evo, that who you are is part of what you bring into the room as a reporter, and that it's there every time. But there were other sides to Evo that I never bought into, and that I think are big lessons for this generation, as they do their own. I mean, they had their own underground press in the internet. I think the things that I do differently now is I don't say the first thing I think. And that's something the Times gave me, and there's a value to that. There's a value to being thoughtful and taking a breath and not hurting others and being careful. We were never careful at Evo, and we said any old crap. And sometimes it went very badly for us. Latimer said something in one of his stories, and then we were thrown out of the Fillmore East, and that was the beginning of the end. So some of the lessons and some of what I take with me is also about what one should not do.
Alex, you traveled around a lot in the 60s, I mentioned. You saw the underground press up close in lots of different cities in Europe and elsewhere. What made the East Village Other distinctive from these other papers?
Oh boy, that wasn't what I wanted to answer at all. In any case, distinctive. The combination of visuals and words. The visual part of it was enormously, in one sentence, that combination of visual and text. I'd like to go on and say what I wanted to say also, if I can. I've given you all this sheet because I knew that I would have very little time to talk, and you have something, even if I can't get through this, you'll have something that represents what my own feelings, my feelings are that we need something, as Peter has said, we need something like Evo today. I don't know whether it'll be on the web or whether it's going to be a paper or how it's going to be, but I want to give you something more than this sheet of paper. The one thing we didn't get, so far as I can tell, is a blackboard. Oh, sure. Eileen, could you get a sheet? I have my wife here who does these things. God save her. Yeah, Eileen will come and give you a sheet. I want to give you a lot more, though, than that. What is it? I want to give you a lot more than that. If I had a blackboard, I would be writing on it, Untold 60s as one word, www.untold60s.net/. After that slash, if you just go to that, you're just going to find out about my book. But after that slash, if you put in 2EVO, the number 2 and EVO and .htm, you will get 2 chapters from the book that have entirely to do with EVO. I don't want to do a lot of reminiscing. We all are, obviously, but you'll be able to get my take on what the history of EVO was, and those 2 chapters are what started Brooke, at least one of the things that started Brooke on this entire project. If after that slash you were to write EVO-NYU, you would get to a chapter that tells you what NYU was like in the year 1970, right after Kent State, and it might surprise you what NYU was like. If after that slash you write sub-radar, and that is on the bottom of the sheet, so you do have that written for you, you will find the first 4 of a series of articles I hope to write. I have not yet made it to Steve's or Claudia's eminence of writing for the New York Times, but I'm hoping that maybe some zine up on the web is going to pick up on this, and I can go on writing these articles. One of them suggests that the entire insurance industry is unethical. This is the sort of thing that EVO would have published in the old days. Another of them suggests that the Afghan government is far less corrupt than the American government, and it gives some proof for that. You begin to get the idea. Something else, if anyone who is watching this on YouTube or on our live cast doesn't have this sheet, if after that slash you put lies, LIES.htm, you will get that sheet also. So I've a little bit prepared. As you can see, I'll try and make this.
Okay.
I'm sorry? Is it too much?
No, well, they're asking, they want you to talk about the East Village Other and your reflection on that particular newspaper.
I don't know anything about the East Village Other. No, I think everyone else is covering it extremely well. And as I've said, if you do go to that particular website, what I want to talk about is why we need something like EVO today, and why.
Very, very briefly, Alice, because this is.
Okay, I do understand.
I'm not sure you do.
Alex, have you heard
I'll
of
leave
the
it there.
internet?
I'll leave it
Because free speech
I want
is
you to
really
demand that I talk more later. So.
Alex, there is son of the East Village Other, son of the underground press. It's called the internet. For better or worse, with all the crap that's on there, it's very vibrant. And it's a way that young people and newcomers can get published. It used to be my students could never get clips. Now it's really easy for them because they write for the Huffington Post for free. There is a vibrancy that the internet provides that is really the child of what we were doing in the underground press, and that part of it's very exciting.
You know, I thought about that because I read that in addition to EVO and Berkeley Barb and a whole bunch of others, there were as many as 200 of these underground newspapers around the country in the late 60s and early 70s. In many ways, it was a way of communicating from this group, which is similar to the way the Arab Spring is and how people communicate in Russia today. And we didn't have any way to do it any other way, so we did it with weekly newspapers. And the other thing I wanted to say was that I think EVO was considered probably absolutely outrageous by the authorities. This was a time not so long before that when in Hollywood, if they showed a husband and wife in a bedroom, there were 2 beds, not 1. There was a law. There was a law. And just about anything could get you in trouble. I know Lenny Bruce, who was somewhat before EVO, was impossible for him to stay out of jail. He wound up in a very distressful state before he died. And I think we also owe a debt to some degree to Krasner's Realist, which had come out before that time.
Yes,
absolutely. Which was a something like EVO, but very much more local, and the district was more of a. Anyway, there were things that were really shaking at that time that have never happened since, and they made a big difference.
Wait a second. There were things of their time, but there are also things, sometimes I read stuff in the New York Times that just blows my mind, that would not be anywhere else. There are investigations that if we didn't have newspapers that did long-form pieces, Evo opened up the mainstream press
That's one of the things it did.
in a way that it wasn't before. It changed the dialogue, and that's one of its contributions.
Let me ask a question. We've got a little bit more time
Can
for...
I say something about that, John?
Yeah.
I think I understand the subject. You're talking about that contribution. Evo was busted, I stopped counting, at 141 times. And there are more, but I say I stopped counting. Evo was pursued by the NYPD,
The Red Squad.
the CIA, the FBI, MI5, the KGB, and the Vatican. So with friends like that, you had to be doing something right.
Well, after that cover, after the Cardinal Spellman cover, I wouldn't
Actually,
be surprised.
A lot of it was surreptitious. In other words, the agencies trying to bring down Evo knew that they were breaking the law. And I refer to my favorite president, Richard Milhouse Nixon. But that was one of the problems of the day. But Evo, God bless the people who were on Evo. They were too silly to whatever, but they didn't give a damn. And they were going to go do what they wanted to do, and they didn't care what happened. I always had to clean up the mess, though.
It was a very scary time in one sense. It was a lot of fun, and most people did not really understand what the consequences would be. Screw was busted many times. The Rat was busted. Various papers were busted. We were always infiltrated by Asian provocateurs and police agents. And so at the New York Free Press, we decided to photograph all the guys that were photographing us.
Yeah.
And we ran 3 covers with undercover police, except we misphotographed one. It was a Daily News reporter, and he sued us. Never got his money. But I remember the day I was first arrested and sent to a precinct, which is now a co-op on the west side. And I went into the booking office, and there were all the cops we had photographed. And, you know, it became a goof for many of us because we felt, you know, we were in America. We wouldn't be hassled so much. We might have to go in front of a judge. We might have to spend the night in jail. But ultimately, we would be freed into this wonderful environment. And it turned out that some people weren't freed, and some people had to pay the price.
We've got about 15 or 20 minutes tops before we turn it over to the audience. I wanted to ask an open question to anyone on the panel. Is there anyone here who would like to sum up a kind of epitomizing experience? Does anyone have an anecdote or a story about your experience with Evo that is somehow especially revealing or telling that you wanted to share?
I'd like to share one that's going to be very embarrassing. Is this, the camera is on? One of the reasons why I would go to Paste Up Night at Evo was to try to get a girlfriend.
Yeah.
And there were always a few young waifs around, and there was one that Charlie might remember who used to hang out in the stat room. She was very thin and very lovely, and I would always make my way into the stat room. And I can honestly say in the entire time that I worked for Evo and for Screw, I never got laid.
That is embarrassing.
I'd like to tell you an anecdote that is kind of amazing. I wrote about it in the stuff on the internet. I wrote about it as an article for this event, which some of you may have read. Around 1970, this is 4 years after my involvement, I got a call from Walter. He was the genius of all this. I think we all know that. And he had run off with a woman who was a Mellon from Pittsburgh. He had interviewed her, or someone had interviewed her. Her name was Peggy Mellon Hitchcock, and he had interviewed her because she was giving away land in Northern California for free to anybody who wanted it. She was sort of the black sheep of the Mellon clan, and he ran off with her. And everyone said, Walter sold out. And yes, it was true. So 3 years later, what I'm doing was thriving in the Hamptons. I was paying occasional visits back to Evo just to see Walter and sometimes Alan. But pretty much I kind of forgot about it, the whole thing. And I got a call from Walter. He was in Aspen, Colorado. And he had broken up with his wife, and he said, let's take over Evo. Between us, we have more than 50% of the shares. And I said, look, I'm kind of busy, I don't want to get too involved in this. He said, well, I've got more shares than you, but I can't do it without you. I said, look, if you want to do it, I'll go and we'll do it, and you can come back and set up the way it was, or however you want. So we met at a coffee shop across from the Fillmore East, and we were plotting there. And we went in and we announced ourselves as taking over Evo. And the staff completely ignored us except for Joel Fabricant, who has said, well, what do you want to see? We understand this, So we started looking through the books. And at that point, we were there one day, and there was graffiti written against us, the rich guys come back to take over Evo. Then the next day, who shows up out of the blue but Peggy Hitchcock's her trust fund lawyer in Tucson, Arizona. And he says, I will not allow Walter, he was still married, I will not allow Walter to do this. He said, this outfit has not paid any kind of government income tax, or maybe not, he didn't say income tax, he said withholding tax. Everything was cash from a cigar box. He said, you can go to jail for this. Won't allow it. And we all went, like just Walter and I were there, and Peggy was not there. And he said, well, maybe he's right. And that's how that ended. And then it went on from there. That's an amazing thing to go through, I have to say.
Ed Sanders, can I bring you back into the conversation? You have a whole book full of lively, amusing anecdotes about your time on the Lower East Side.
Yeah,
well,
he straightens that story out before he prints it.
A specific Evo, as I said in my previous remarks, at its beginning at least, it was a neighborhood newspaper. It covered issues right off the streets. When the police crashed into hippie communes, urban communes run by Groovy and Galahad on East 11th, Walter, or reporter, was there asking the police. And the Fugs, we gave a yearly concert in Tompkins Square Park, free. And in early '66, my bookstore was raided by a bunch of cops, and I was arrested for obscenity for my magazine, Fuck You, a magazine of the arts. And the arresting officer named Sergeant Feta did not like me, and he would appear where I was, and one of the times he appeared was at the concert the Fugs gave at the Van Shell in Tompkins Square Park in August of 1966. And there was a bomb scare, and so they came, and so they stopped the concert, and there was my arresting officer looking for bombs in all our musette bags and wallets and people's pocketbooks. And so who was there, though, asking questions of this cop was Walter Boart with a tape recorder, asking, why are you doing this? Why are you doing this? What's going on? Do you like the music? And we had 10,000 people in the park, so it was totally packed, so he couldn't get too freaky, this cop. He was on it. But anyway, Walt Boart made a tape transcript. He ran an article about the concert and about his conversation with Sergeant Feta. But that was an example of Evo's hands-on, in spite of its spiral universal cosmos layout. It was very specific, isolating the image, the causes of the time: the war, LSD, pot, the commune movement. It was right on.
I wrote an article called Fucking Through the Ages. It had wonderful illustrations because it was a review of a book which itself was about an exhibit put on in Scandinavia of erotic art, and I chose the best possible visual. I think you'll be happy to know the best possible visuals for this. We got sued by a couple of towns in New Jersey, and I think there were some problems in California too. Joel Fabricant came to me and he started to blame me as much as he possibly could, and I said, look, what are we about? He finally decided, well, it's probably good for circulation in the long run.
Why don't can we open it up for questions from the audience? We got about 30 minutes or so, and there's a bunch of questions. How about right here? Hold on, Brooke is gonna pass around a microphone so you get captured on the audio.
I'm relatively new to the East Village, but when I was by the former site of the 2nd Avenue Deli, which is now the bank, and I looked down on the ground, and those plaques are unkempt. Why I mention this is everyone seems to laud the fact that they gain their prominence or notoriety by being connected to the East Village. Why is nothing being preserved? The fact is, if you walk down St. Mark's Place, you feel like you're in a third world country. That was one of the most creative blocks in history because nobody knew what they were doing, but they wanted to create.
I want to respond to him.
Peter.
The largest artist colony ever assembled in the history of the world has been wiped out.
Yes.
That is the legacy of America, because the arts cannot have independent artists anymore. The city knew that it was destroying this artist colony. The great crime was that while that artist colony was being destroyed, it was also generating the very first American Renaissance in the arts. It was music, it was writing, it was visual arts, it was everything all together. And it got wiped out. And you can thank my favorite president for that.
No, it was brought about
And
by rent control.
I want to just say one more thing.
World War II rent control.
What
Can
you
I
saying?
pick up on what Ed said, because
Well,
that's
no.
really important? May I pick up?
Let's let Peter finish real quickly, and then
Yeah.
we'll move.
Yeah, what I wanted to say was that it did start after World War II, because there were only 2 artist colonies left in the world after World War II. One was the corporate colony in Hollywood, and the other was the Bohemian colony right here in Lower Manhattan. And after World War II, you started to see the education of artists by all of the WPA artists. They were the ones who began to train them. Their work, incidentally, if there are any young students here want to search for a lost American treasure, go try and find the 115,000 canvases that were produced by the artists on the WPA Arts Project. Where are they? No one knows, but the government wants them back now. They're claiming ownership. The legacy amongst the artists themselves, right, what they said they thought happened was that they were sold after World War II in a surplus auction under the generic name oiled canvas. They were bought by a plumbing supply contractor who used them to wrap plaster and asbestos on steam pipes. Try it out, folks, America. That's our legacy in the arts.
May I one quick thing.
And
You're
what
still
happened, I want to say
beautiful.
one other thing. Renaissance is a real thing. It's not something that happened in the past. It has a socioeconomic quality to it that's extremely important. And one of the reasons why America is having problems today economically is because it doesn't believe in that kind of creativity. It increases real estate values. Everyone wants to live where artists live. And it was that one factor that New York City focused on beyond all others. It could have saved the artist colony.
We're going to take
It
another.
elected not to.
We're going to take another question. Claudia wants to jump in real quickly on this.
Just very quickly, What Ed said is tremendously important. Rent control was the difference that made the Lower East Side so vibrant. The late Paul Goodman used to say, the 60s were a time when it was possible to be decently poor. It is no longer possible for anyone to be decently poor. And so you can't be a young person, as I was living on Avenue C and East 6th Street for $50.53 a month. There's no way. What my students have instead is $100,000 in student debt, which makes them indebted. They can't express themselves the way we could because of it.
We got a question here.
Yeah, my name is Jim Forat, and I just wanted to say that everything you've said resonates strongly with me, but there's one thing that you haven't talked about, which was the vibrant political life that emerged in the East Village. From the Jade Companions, who had their bail film for the drug dealers, to the yippies, to the motherfuckers. And it resonates very strongly today with what one sees in Occupy Wall Street. And the East Village Other, covered those events. The planting of the tree in St. Mark's Place, the flower power on the top of Con Edison to do way before the environmental movement, the dropping of money on Wall Street, all of those things and many more were covered by the East Village Other. You also had women's liberation and gay liberation coming and being critical of some of the things that you old men are still being romantic about.
We've got a question over here.
Oh, hi. I find it curious that no one on the panel has brought up maybe the possible influence of Barney Rossett's Evergreen Review, which does predate the East Village Other.
I was art director for Evergreen Review in its decline, and it was an amazing, and Ramparts on the West Coast.
My point is that what was the influence, if there was an influence there, on these newspapers, because he was a little ahead.
He was a little ahead, but the early Evergreen, when Evo started, was that journal-size publication. It was very much out of the beat aesthetic. It wasn't until it became a magazine, which was very slick compared to what was going on in the underground press. And there was a dichotomy there. It was very difficult for a young person to wrap their head around Evo's look and what Evo was saying. It was the older left versus the newer left. But today it still resonates. And as I said, even more so, Ramparts resonates because it was much more political, much more radical in its journalism than Evergreen was.
But Evergreen took a lot of heat. They printed Che Guevara's diary after he was assassinated, and the right-wing Cubans bombed and injured Barney Rossett in the summer of '68.
Yeah, they bombed the office on University.
They threw a incendiary bomb through the glass window on the second floor by the Cedar Bar on University Place. And so Barney Rossett and Evergreen, and in my generation from the 50s, the Evergreen Review was one of the reasons I left Missouri. I mean, it was such a powerful, wonderful publication, the early Evergreen Reviews.
Thank you. How about, I say mail the microphone there.
Yeah, there's another point to be made about countercultures being destroyed. I was living in Haight-Ashbury in 1968 and 69, and in 1969 I went to Mexico. When I got back, the whole culture was disseminated by Mayor Alioto at the time, who allowed the police to come in to bring hard drugs into the street. They were doing speed and smack, and they were purposely doing this. I think this has been done in Harlem at times in that time in history as well. And the whole culture was disseminated. A few years later, his wife, less than a few years later, his wife bought up the property. It was bargain basement prices, and in a few years after that, it went sky high, and all the yuppies moved into the place. And it was kind of a weird mixture, but that's what happened to Haight-Ashbury. Most of the culture moved to Berkeley, California in the early 70s. Or I did a radio show at the time.
Do you want to pass the microphone this way? There's a woman right in front of you, and then there's a man up here.
Could I ask
Hi, I'm Amber LeMan, and I was
then we'll get to
John
you.
Wilcox's wife and co-publisher when we were doing the East Village,
New York
other
scenes.
scenes. John edited Evo for a short while, and the one thing that hasn't been mentioned is how he and Tom Farrat, and I think people at Evo originally, started the Underground Press Syndicate, which, and the basics was you could use anybody else's stuff as long as you gave credit. And that was so important to those papers out in Chicago and LA.
One of the things is that the Underground Press Syndicate and the idea of underground newspapers spread worldwide, as Alex will tell you, in Europe too. And this is one of the things. There were hundreds of underground papers throughout the United States. They were short-lived many times, but some, were around for a period of time. But that was the Katzman brothers. Donald first wrote about it, and then Alan actually went to a meeting and came back and said, we have the syndicate, right, the Underground Press
But
Syndicate.
it was John Wilcox and it was Tom Farrat that kept it going, and set it up.
Going. There are others kept it going, yeah. I'm talking about
so.
where it started.
I was the Berlin correspondent for the Underground Press Syndicate, and my first articles in Evo appeared in that way. I want to point out that in a lot of ways, the other countries came out ahead of America as much as we did. In Amsterdam, it is still possible to go into places and smoke pot. It's technically illegal, but they don't enforce the laws. In Germany, the German youth were a lot braver than us. The word Nazi gets thrown about very loosely, but the young Germans were in fact fighting real Nazis, their parents. That was how it was. And in England, there was a whole class divide that more or less got crossed. In some ways, all the other countries came ahead of us.
I just wanted to add one small thing about the graphics, how important the graphics were in our paper, in Evo, in all of the underground papers, Crumb, all of that stuff, that really helped the revolution. Thanks.
And it was thanks to photo offset. I mean, it was a printing process that made, just as the internet, as Claudia's been saying, opened up things for everybody in terms of having your own personal printing press on your desktop. Offset, and there was a printer over on 22nd Street. I think he was called the Chinaman because he was Chinese. J. Kim, and his son runs the place now. So you could go there, and for $250, you could print your own underground paper.
I didn't realize there's a microphone on this side of the room too, so I want to go here, and then we'll switch back and forth. I see your hand too.
People identify
Thank
themselves.
you. Yeah, my name is Therese Coe. I was with the New York Free Press with Steve Heller. I was an editor and a writer there under the editorship of Sam Edwards. And I have a couple of little things to say and then a question. First of all, it's interesting the parallels. Of course, we were going at the same time Evo was going. I assume Evo started first, though. And Sam, the editor-in-chief, never took a penny from the New York Free Press, and he was also a bartender at the 55 bar on Sheridan Square, and that's how he partly supported the New York Free Press. And an interesting thing about that newspaper is that the way someone asked about a defining moment, for Evo or any defining moment. Well, for the New York Free Press and Screw, the way Screw under Jim Buckley, who was our managing editor at the New York Free Press, and Al Goldstein, who had nothing to do with the New York Free Press, but was famous for, and I think it's okay to say this now so many years later, the way he got the money together to put Screw together, which he did practically for free, except for his and Jim's profit, because they took over the New York Free Press. They sneaked in with the key that Jim had in the middle of the night and used all our justifying machines. That's what they were called then, justifying machines, you know, where you printed the columns and then you pasted them up. They did the whole issue of Screw in one night. And when we came in the morning, it was a mess. And we could see that pornography or slutty stuff had been published. And Sam was so angry. Sam was this big, strong guy from Nevada. He took his fist and he put it right through. He punched the wall and he put it right through the plasterboard wall. He was so angry about it. And they made a big success of Screw. Just that was how they put out the first weekly issue. And after that, they could afford their own place, I guess. But there were other similarities. For example, we also had a cigar box in cash only. And I still remember that I got paid $75 a week for 5.5 days. And so I was actually, and also one other thing, before I ask you what you got paid, if anything, at Evo, I'm just curious, because I don't think I ever knew. Maybe it was nothing. But there were weeks that there was no money. But also, what brought about the arts renaissance?
What about the what?
Psychedelics and cannabis. That's what brought it about. It would never have happened without psychedelics and cannabis. I mean, that's very important.
Music.
Music, of course, yes, you're right. But what brought out the music?
Could you do me a favor? And there's a woman behind you. We pass that microphone. And then while you're doing that, there's a question up here. Real quick, does someone want to tell you what your salaries were 40 years ago?
I got $50 a week.
25 a week over here.
If you got it.
I never got paid in.
But I'd like to say that I get less today from the Atlantic for a weekly column than I did for Evo.
What did you get?
All right, but I promise there's a guy here who's been waiting, but then we'll go to you.
I wanted to say a couple things about, for one thing, art being destabilized. Jeffrey Lewis just wrote a piece, and in his research he found out that the CIA was behind the abstract expressionist movement.
Yes.
Because they wanted this new form of art to become dominant, because there's no way through abstract art you can express anything politically. And I could see the CIA bidding up all these.
There were other reasons.
There are other reasons as well. It's a Steve Weber song. The other thing was, as far as drugs destabilizing Ed pointed out that the way the scene was referred to by the people that were actually there was the set. Like no one said, I'm a hippie, I'm a beatnik, but you know, we're on the set, so-and-so should be bricked off the set. And anyway, drugs hit the set really hard by the summer of 1962. The Diggers in San Francisco put up these posters in early 1967. The way they went was, last week, this 16-year-old girl from Marin County came to the Hague to see what was going on. Some guy fed her a bunch of LSD and speed and rented her out for a gangbang for $5 a pop.
Oh, dear.
And that was the worst thing that happened since the week before when this 16-year-old girl from Oakland came. In other words, bad drug things were happening like crazy by 1967. The confluence of Summer of Love, ex-cons thinking girls who fuck, drugs, let's go. I mean, basically the scene, when it once got publicized, attracted major sleaze like flies on horse shit. And that was the basic thing that I believe brought the scene down.
Oh, okay, Occupy Oakland. It's being recorded. Just use the mic, please.
I just wanted point of information to know, a show of hands, how many people here worked on or wrote for an underground publication? That's all I wanted to know. Okay.
That was Does anyone have a question for any of the panelists as opposed to a comment? Yeah.
Yes. Rat Subterranean News, the official organ of the Weather Underground, was mentioned in passing. How would you compare the politics at RAT with the politics of Evo, and would you consider the takeover of RAT by the Women's Collective to be the official beginning of the feminist movement in America?
I often say that, and I'm not sure whether I'm making this up or not, but I remember hearing, because the offices for RAT were then on 14th Street, and the women came up with rifles. So I'm not imagining that.
No, you're not. And across the street, there was that window that had the tripod and the camera where the FBI was filming everything going on at RAT at the same time.
I would say that, you said it yourself, RAT was the organ of SDS. And the SDS folks had very little humor. Although,
and you had to carry papers
the art director of RAT at the time, Bob Eisner, later followed me to the New York Times. So his politics never got in the way.
I think I might have replaced you as RAT as the ad manager. RAT was like doing all sex ads.
Well, RAT started a sex paper called Pleasure.
That's extraordinary news.
No, I changed the advertising base of RAT from the sex ads to things like the Rosicrucians and Shining Path.
Well, I got my divinity degree through RAT. The Church of the Sacred something or other.
Yeah, we had
to get out of the draft, right?
When RAT got busted, Evo brought out an issue from our own offices.
Who else has a question for one of the panelists, or any of them?
Hi, I'm Alan Moore. I work for the East Village Eye.
Oh, hey.
I was a typesetter, so I got paid. But I'm here with the Squatting Europe Collective. We concluded a 5-day discussion about the political squatting movement, social center occupations in Europe. And I would like to ask you, from a historical point of view, about squatting and communes and collective living and the occupation of large buildings by political groups in the Lower East Side during the period when you guys were working as reporters.
Squatting was more a European movement than it was an American movement at that time. I visited squats in Amsterdam. I went to squats in London. I don't believe there were any in Berlin. They were a little too uptight about property. But I've always been surprised that there's been so little of it here, particularly back in the 70s, 80s, when there were a great many derelict buildings around. That's about all I can tell you about it.
When Walter Boart left toward the end of 1967, we inherited his loft, which was on East 2nd Street. It was 5,000 square feet. The rent was $85 a month. So, right, it was a bargain. Well, I don't know if it was a bargain. People, But anyway, we used that as a place for people to live. And at some point, there might have been as many as 30 people living there. We used to have a grocery delivery once a week. And there were artists there from all over, not just Evo's people, but people from all over the world. They would visit and they would stay at the loft. Someday someone's going to write a book about that place, because I told a story a short time ago about being told in 1989 that I had to go see a play that was in the theater here on 10th and First Avenue. And I said, why should I go to this play? Because the author wants you to go. I said, well, who's the author? And he told me the name of this fellow. He's a Brit, but it didn't ring any bell to me. I said, I don't know that guy. He said, oh, yes, you do. He said, you may not know him, but he says that he stayed at the loft for 2 years.
Listen, wait a second.
Without being in that loft, right, he never would have gotten his start in showbiz.
Yeah.
But there are a lot of stories like that I've received over the years.
I just got to tell Peter, do you know who's here? Rayanne Rubenstein, who was our fearless, brilliant, most gorgeous photographer who never took crap from anyone and always got her picture and always got it beautifully. She's here.
Where is she?
She's right there with her camera.
Oh, wow. Wow.
Maybe one or two more?
Yeah, we got just a few minutes left for questions, then there's
Yeah.
going to be a reception. Oh, yeah, here we go.
Back then, I recall, in addition to newspapers, there was an underground film movement. There was an underground film movement in New York. Jonas Mekas, Ed Emschuler, Kenneth Anger, right? There was all this stuff going on. And I remember the EVO as well. What was it? Was there a connection there? Did you guys support that movement? Did you give them places to screen their movies?
Someone named Judd Yalcott covered that scene for Evo, as I recall.
And Dick Preston originally. And yes, they did. One of the things that Evo did that was not like the regular press was that it did cover the underground films and also reviewed rock and roll. That wasn't common then. Only in the alternative press did you see that kind of reporting. So yeah, the underground film movement.
By the way, you neglected to mention Bob Downey Sr.
That's right.
Who there was
That's right.
the Charles Street Cinema over on Avenue A.
There was actually, you talk about a loft, there was a building down there, the Mother's something or other, which was a place for filmmakers to go do their work.
Yeah, it was the
also.
documentary,
Yeah, it was on the
Liberation
corner,
documentary
yeah.
or something.
And it was
Newsreel. That's
the Millennium Film Workshop. I think they were in
We've
the
got time for one more question, and then there's going to be a reception downstairs.
Take the chair home.
Yeah, this is a shaker exercise. The chairs must be
Okay,
put
so we're
in their
gonna
place.
take a question. People are gonna fold their chairs, and then in 10 minutes there'll be food and
Is
wine.
it the other side, or you want the other side?
No, we still got time for one more question, though, right? Hold on, let's hold off for one last question. Thank you.
Peter brought up an interesting point, like why there are no underground newspapers currently, as there were in days of the late 60s, early 70s. Peter and I actually met in 1989 when we started doing The Shadow on the Lower East Side. It seems to me that the underground press emerged as a response to the Vietnam War and a bunch of other issues, just as The Shadow, which is the paper I was associated with, emerged as a result of the Tompkins Square Park riot in 1988. It seems like every generation needs to respond to a new, let's say, situation or political environment, and they need to like address things that the mainstream media is not going to do. I have to say, thanks to Ed Sanders, we were influenced to do The Shadow. Thanks to East Village Other, we were influenced to do The Shadow. We had a bookstore called Sabotage Books on St. Mark's Place, another couple of other anarchist bookstores, which were influenced by Ed doing Peace-Eye books. So really, the East Village Other and The Rat were influences for The Shadow. And The Shadow stopped publishing physically in 2008. We had about 19 years of doing it. There should be another newspaper. Even though there's the internet, there's nothing like holding a newspaper in your hands, reading it, feeling it, taking in information in a visual manner. The correct combination, correct balance of graphic and text to engage the reader, to get them to read and absorb what you presented to them. You can do that to a certain extent on the internet, but it's like watching TV, and it's just something special about a newspaper. So today you do it with recycled paper and soy-based inks in a responsible, ecological manner, but really there should be another newspaper, and I'm with you, Peter, there should be some other newspaper, because there's no underground media other than maybe indie media. That's probably the closest I see, but they don't quite have the EVO or the Rat or the Shadow's edge. They don't really go far enough. We need more newspapers like Evo, Fuck You, the Rat, and the Shadow.
Well, there you have it. Is that it? We're going to do one last question. Oh, that would have been a nice note to end on.
I was a high school student from 1965 to 1969, and the Rat and Evo were my Bibles. I used to have to hide them from my mother. And I learned pretty quickly, if you went to the Fillmore after the bands had started, and you said you wrote for the East Village Other, you could get in for free.
Smart cookie. Yay.
Thank you, everyone, for coming out. This has been a really tremendous experience. Please remember, please remember to fold up your chairs and regroup downstairs for a reception. I think there's also some books for sale. Thank you.